Hello, it's John Turner, the head of the Global Mining Group at Fasken. Welcome to our webinar series, Mining Issues in a Changing World. Today's topic is under the catchy title of Critical Minerals Supply Chains for Clean Technology, a New Economic Opportunity. We're very fortunate to have an international panel with us today that Kevin O'Callaghan will introduce, but we do have practitioners from Australia, the US, and the UK. As well as people talking about opportunities in the lithium space particularly, and the particular challenges for new producers. For those of you who don't know the Fasken firm, we're approximately 750 lawyers in Canada, South Africa, United Kingdom, and China. And we have been ranked #1 globally in mining for 11 times, including the last 5 years in a row. Without any further ado, I'm going to pass over to my partner, Kevin O'Callaghan. Kevin?
Thank you very much, John, and thank you all for attending. My name is Kevin O'Callaghan, and I'm with Fasken's Vancouver office, and I will be moderating today's webinar. We have an exciting lineup today with speakers from around the world, as John outlined, here to provide us some insights on an area that is becoming increasingly important to our economies as they emerge and try to surge and develop the green economies. And this new kind of clean technology fundamentally depends on an array of minerals at its foundation. And those minerals are not always garden variety. And because those minerals are critical to the development of these technologies, we call them critical minerals. Over the next hour and a bit, we'll be hearing from speakers on critical minerals, and clean energy transition, lithium, Australia's critical minerals path, US regulatory developments, critical minerals, the Canadian federal government position regarding critical minerals, challenges facing new producers, and then we'll spend some time on a Q&A. So we'll have about just over an hour, I think, of speakers, and then some time for a Q&A. There should be a little button on your screen which would allow you to submit questions for the Q&A. Please do that. We want it to be as interactive as possible, so please submit some questions and you can submit them at any time throughout the speakers. So as they come up, as they occur to you, please submit them. There should also be another little button on your screen which will allow you to enter in some information on a short form regarding feedback on today's session. We'd really much appreciate you taking the time to fill that in. Over the next slide. So our first speaker will be Guy Winter from our Fasken's London office. Guy is recognized for his particular expertise in capital markets, private equity, and M&A, and joint ventures and complex reorganizations. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about clean energy. Over to you, Guy.
Thank you so much, Kevin. As Kevin kindly said, I'm a partner in the London office of Fasken's. I sit both in the global energy and the global mining groups. And I guess that's the perspective that I would really like to share with you today. This is an area in battery metals and more widely in critical minerals, which really represents that intersect between energy and mining. And if I can just ask Fareed to move on to the next slide, just to put a bit of context on where we currently find ourselves. Now, I don't know whether people will find this depressing or inspiring, but certainly where we currently find ourselves is underneath the red wave. We'd expect to see the blue one of recession coming after that, but then really towering over all of that is the climate change challenge that we all find ourselves facing. And I think the sheer scale of that challenge means that it's really going to pervade all aspects of economic activity, and mining is certainly going to be no exception to that. But also the scale of that challenge means that it will be an immense stimulus for innovation. And it's going to throw up some huge challenges and opportunities for the mining sector. I think it will become increasingly important to keep pace with the technological advancement that we're seeing in the energy sector. And so with the amount of investment that is being poured into the energy sector, the technology and therefore the requirements for minerals, that sort of horizon scanning aspect for mining companies to keep a real close track on the technological advancements in the energy sector will be increasingly important. Secondly, I think it's going to be incredibly important to continue the push towards ESG that we've seen in the mining sector. The whole concept of recovery from the red wave in terms of building back better is obviously going to put a massive emphasis on the ESG of all of the businesses in the supply chain. And mining, with the historical issues that it's had and the efforts that are being put into ESG now, will be a really important area to make sure that it's fully compliant and fully able to take the opportunities of being in that clean energy supply chain. And I think as a related point to that, ensuring that the mining sector is able to tap into the enormous financing sources that will be opened up by the technological revolution that we're seeing in the energy sector. We know that the tech companies have got massive resources, are massive procurers of minerals, but increasingly there are governmental, intergovernmental, and other ESG-focused sources of finance with a real keen emphasis on that green energy transition. And I mean, we've all seen in various countries around the world the sustainable bond rush. All of these offer a very valuable source of finance for the mining sector if it can ensure that those ESG standards are met. Fareed, if you could move on to the next slide. So it's a slightly busy slide in some ways, but I think it gives us a bit of an idea of what I mean by the scale of the change we've had. So if you look at the image on the left-hand side, and that's really focused on Great Britain grid carbon intensity. Now, a few years ago, this would have been absolutely mind-blowing to people to see coal not appearing at all in the energy mix for the UK grid. And so to see wind sitting there at the top is why many people have been seeing the COVID conditions. And you can see that this screenshot was taken in May of this year. This is really a vision into the future. We've never had data like this. The grid has never had the challenges that are involved in having no baseload coal on the system. And just looking at the different constituents there, there's no coal clearly. The renewables are absolutely dominating. That gives rise to very significant challenges in terms of balancing the grid. And that's one of the reasons why we see so many opportunities at the moment in battery storage and other forms of energy storage. Because as soon as you have wind and solar at the top of the pile there, both of them intermittent energy sources, that tells us that there's going to be a huge amount of intermittency and therefore a huge challenge to balance the grid at times of peak demand. And then interestingly also to see France and Belgium. So, we left, or we are leaving the European Union, but we still have interconnectors to continental Europe. And as part of balancing the grid going forward, as part of increasing the renewable energy mix that is used on the grid, you'd expect to see interconnectors to continental Europe, perhaps also to Iceland and to Norway, becoming a really important way to make sure that everywhere the sun will be shining at some point, the wind will be blowing, and if you can join those up, then that's going to give you the best possible opportunity to balance the power where you need it. The image on the right-hand side is just a perspective on the position in the United States. And what you can see is that the consumption of coal has dropped off very, very significantly. And the portion of wind power in that market, which is the green fraction there in the graph, is really growing very significantly. And so similarly, in the United States, those challenges in terms of how you replace the reliable baseload of coal and bring in renewable energy to the grid are going to arise. And the scale of the growth opportunity. So in a report last week, Goldman Sachs projected that there would be $16 trillion of investment through 2030 in the renewable energy sector. And that 2021 would be the first year in which renewables overtook oil and gas drilling. And all of this supported by the fact that the borrowing costs in the renewable energy sector are massively lower than in oil and gas development. So incredibly strong stimuli to continue this revolution, which then in turn has a very significant impact in the supply chain that feeds into it. Fareed, if you can move on to the next slide. And also in terms of the position in which we find ourselves globally at the moment. It's clear this concept of building back better is going to represent a new deal in many, many jurisdictions around the world. And in many cases, the focus of that is going to be on making sure that it's through renewable development. And so within the European Union, which we're currently transitioning out of here, wind, solar, and green hydrogen have really formed the kind of key focuses there. And I think in terms of the mining sector, it's crucial to bear in mind that there are huge strategic drivers for the European Union to take this approach. It isn't solely about some desire to benefit the world. It's obviously focusing on how employment, competitiveness, and a strategic advantage can be gained within Europe. It's putting Europe as a huge net importer of minerals and raw materials from the great mining jurisdictions of the world. And so a lot of the emphasis of these programs is really moving away from the raw materials that Europe imports from the rest of the world and focusing on the value-added technologies that Europe would like to export. And so, for example, in the hydrogen sector, what we expect to see is a huge arms race in terms of countries looking to develop strategic advantage in terms of making sure that they have the most advanced and ambitious plans in hydrogen with a view to exporting that around the rest of the world. Rather like what has happened in the wind sector, where Denmark has established itself as a tiny country in the north of Europe as a global leader in wind power. Moving on to the next slide, Fareed, and just a bit of a look at what we see as the new energy structure, infrastructure, and how that is going to impact the mining sector, which represents such a key supply chain to it. A lot of the fuss will tend to be on electric vehicles and the attendant charging networks. Of course, it's Tesla adverts and car adverts that are on TV. And of course, that's going to be an incredibly important factor. It's going to continue to consume a huge amount of lithium, which I know Paul will be talking about shortly, nickel, cobalt, and graphite. But actually, the charging networks themselves lead on to the wider point about battery energy storage systems. So in order to have super fast EV chargers around our towns and cities, we're also going to need to ramp up very significantly the amount of energy storage capacity that there is. Our towns and cities weren't necessarily designed to have a huge number of motor vehicles being charged within them at any time of day or night. And so that whole infrastructure, as well as the wider imperative to balance the renewable energy on the grid, is going to continue to lead to a huge amount of development of battery energy storage capacity. And of course, we see Tesla as a global leader already. The amazing work that they did on the South Australian battery storage project, but that will now be rolled out in many, many different places around the world. We see a lot of projects with co-location of offshore wind generation and large utility scale battery projects. And I think that will continue to be a mega trend as the renewable energy penetration continues. I touched already on the use of interconnectors. Some people already project to a global supergrid. The sun is always shining somewhere. The wind is always blowing somewhere. A small portion of the Sahara could power the world with renewable energy. But of course, you need those interconnectors. You need that grid infrastructure with the copper and aluminium wiring. Green hydrogen I touched upon in the European Union context. That is going to be a very important feature of all of the European stimulus programs. And it's going to raise some interesting challenges, some competitive challenges in terms of the battery storage sector, the demand for the materials to go into those, and how much of that can be replaced with hydrogen fuel cells, for example, or hydrogen as storage. And I think that the last point that I'd like to leave you with is really, I touched at the beginning of my remarks upon the need to keep scanning the horizon, to stay nimble, to keep watching where that demand for minerals is. And of course, we don't know yet what are finally going to be the super technologies that come in to replace burning fossil fuels. Fuel cells, batteries, they're all battling it out. No one wants to be on the wrong side of history and be the Betamax of the new energy revolution. And similarly, it's going to be really important for the supply chain to make sure that they're always astute to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Guy. On to the next slide. So next we're hearing from Paul Fornazzari, who is in our Toronto office. Paul focuses on corporate commercial securities, mining, and natural resources, and has a particular expertise in lithium mining, which he'll share with us today.
Hi, everybody. It's Paul Fornazzari. Hopefully you can hear me well. Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, I've been around the lithium space I think for a while. In a previous life, I helped put together, and I was chairman of Lithium Americas, which was one of the early entrants into the capital markets in Canada, and we helped discover a great project, finance it, and is now working with companies working with Ganfeng to put their project in Jujuy in northern Argentina into production. So through that and other activities, I've got some familiarity with the space. But I caveat that I'm a lawyer, and primarily a lawyer, so you're getting industry information from a lawyer, so take it with a grain of salt. So I'm going to talk very generally and quickly about lithium supply and demand as it started and the various waves that we've seen. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the lithium triangle, which I'm very familiar with in Latin America, which comprises the north of Chile, north of Argentina, and part of Bolivia, and let you know what's going on there kind of in the mining world. Very briefly, you've all heard that lithium is the lightest metal. It's got the greatest kind of electrochemical potential, and it's excellent for energy storage and energy to weight performance. So it is one of the main, I won't say main, but important components to this whole EV revolution, as well as traditional, has a lot of traditional uses as well. Before this whole EV clean technology movement, it was a sleepy, steady business controlled by 3 or 4 main producers, and it's used from everything from grease to portable electronic devices to medical uses for bipolar. In fact, in the late 2000s, when I was getting involved with creating Lithium Americas, I told my parents, who are both doctors, that I was getting into lithium business, and they were very excited because they said that is a great product for bipolar medicines. So a little different than what's going on now. The demand drivers, I think, are pretty obvious and well understood. Governments around the world are pushing to reduce pollution by reducing carbon emissions. It was mentioned that there's a lot of stimuluses around the world. The EU is talking about a $22 billion stimulus package in Europe for EVs and charging stations and many other things. China has been the leader in this industry. I think they realized that they had to do something about their pollution problems. They were early into the space, and now they dominate the industry. Notwithstanding Tesla, China is where this whole EV revolution is happening. There's improved economics for lithium batteries, which means that there are many more applications available on a cheaper basis. This is all through kind of expansion of manufacturing facilities. These mega factories are getting built now everywhere, and benefits of economies of scale. Just a neat example, I think Sony in the 1990s sold a battery with an energy density of 90 watt-hours per kilogram for $2,000 per kilowatt hour. That battery in 2010 went from about $2,000 to about $900 per kilowatt hour. Fast forward to 2019, Panasonic, one of the providers to Tesla, it put out a 150 watt-hour kilogram battery for $250. So the price, you can just see significant drop and much more power out of those batteries. The last demand driver that I'll mention is that there's much more market acceptance of EVs with kind of the younger generations adopting them. Plus, Tesla has really revolutionized the industry. They made the electric vehicle very attractive around the world. Going back to my Lithium Americas days, we partnered with Mitsubishi in 2010 around there because they were producing the iNEV, which was a little bubble car. It was all electric. It was a really cool little car. It was very fast, and they thought the world of it. They spent a lot of money on it, so they wanted to secure supply to Lithium Americas. Anyway, that car went nowhere. They shut it down. I think they were way too early to the game, and that car was just a little bubble car. It was just not very design friendly, but the technology was interesting. So the experts are predicting that EVs will overtake gas vehicles by 2035. So in 15 years, the experts are saying we're going to see more electric vehicles than gas-powered vehicles, which is really remarkable. Currently, the numbers are in China, EVs are about 8% of the sales in China, and Europe about 5%. So a long way to go, but the trend is certainly showing that that's going to happen. Now, COVID has reduced EV sales globally, but COVID has affected everything. So I think post-COVID, the trend is expected to continue. Demand for lithium has been increasing since the early 2000s, and this trend is expected to continue as EVs penetrate the market. Almost every major car company is going full electric, like VW, or has an electric line in the works. I mentioned Tesla. They're now bigger by market cap than General Motors. Again, who would have seen that coming, 10 years ago? I mentioned this, but non-EV demand for lithium has been steady and growing for decades. It was a nice sleepy business, but EVs have just absolutely blown this industry out of the water. Now EVs account for more than 50% of lithium demand, and there are traditional lithium users like Corningware for hardening glass, that have trouble sourcing lithium, given that it's all going to these big contracts for cars. Another very interesting data point that shows that we're really there in terms of this transformation to EVs. CATL, one of the larger battery makers in China, announced it developed a formula. Well, it's been working on a formulation of a lithium battery called lithium iron phosphate battery. They call it the million-mile battery, and they're saying that it will go 1 million miles and it will go for 16 years, and it will be half the price, and it is much safer than what's currently out there. And Tesla has signed up to put those batteries into the Model 3s that they're producing in China. CATL is opening up factories in Germany and here the UK as well. So again, we're certainly moving into an electrified world. I was going to talk about a little bit of the dynamics between lithium carbonate and lithium hydroxide, but I think my time is a bit limited. There's a dynamic there. Those are the two main products that are being produced. Lithium carbonate mostly out of the brines in Argentina, and lithium hydroxide from the hard rocks in Australia. Price is important. Lithium carbonate pricing was all the rage. It was going through the roof in 2017. Spot in China was hitting like $20,000 a ton, and this was all driven by the stimulus that was happening in China at the time. China was putting in, and continues to put in, a lot of money into this industry, was putting money into the processors with very low and interest-free loans. So the processors were all building out infrastructure, and therefore there was this speculation of undersupply, and there was a lot of buying around that time on that basis. Things have come down. Prices have come back to, I think, historic numbers at around $7,000 a ton. It feels like a massive drop, but it is really more of a level setting expectation event. And that's had an important ripple effect. So the hard rocks, which are traditionally more expensive for production of lithium, are suffering more than the brines in Argentina and Argentina and Chile. But even the brine companies that had announced massive expansions are now stopping all of their or curtailing most of those expansion plans. And the hard rock companies in Australia, other than perhaps Greenbushes, which is really the best, the Blue Ribbon project, is they're either going care and maintenance or shutting down altogether. I'm being told to wrap up. So I've touched upon supply. I think it's going to be very hard to bring new supply on very quickly to meet demand. So I think in the very short term, we're going to see very tight supply because expansion plans take time. There isn't a lot of financing available for new mines. The new mines that have all tried to come online have had major technical problems in Canada, in Argentina, or Corbe's had serious difficulties. So it's a very long and difficult, technically difficult process to bring a mine online. So I think demand is growing and supply is going to have trouble keeping pace. In terms of what's happening in the lithium triangle, super interesting. I'm being told to wind it down, so maybe I'll cover off the lithium triangle in the Q&A section so I can let other people speak. I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Paul. On to the next slide. Next up, we have Simon Scott, who leads MinterEllison's Energy and Resources team. And we really appreciate Simon. There's some technical issues, he says, with respect to his video, so he may not show up his video. But we also recognize that it's 2 in the morning where he joins us from. So perhaps he just doesn't want us to see him in his pajamas. But anyways, he has more than 20 years experience across the energy and resources sector. Over this time, Simon has led teams on major mining projects, cross-border joint ventures, M&A transactions in the critical mining space, mineral space. Simon's led their team advising Albemarle Corporation on its investment in and joint venture with Mineral Resources in the Wodgina lithium mine in the Pilbara, and the Kemerton lithium hydroxide facility in Western Australia. Simon will give us some insights on what's going on in Australia, who as a state has been quite active in this area. Thanks, Simon.
Thanks, Kevin. Hello or good day all. So look, I'll, as Kevin mentioned, I'll provide a brief summary of where Australia is up to in terms of the government's positioning, and also our foreign investment regime and some implications for and some recent developments in the critical mineral space. So Australia, like Canada and the US, has a focus on critical minerals policy at the moment and promotion of investment in this as a subsector of its broader minerals endowment development. Australia has recognised the risks of dependency on the concentrated supply chains in the essential minerals such as these, and to this end released in 2019 a critical minerals strategy, March 2019, focused on promotion of investment and encouraging downstream processing in critical minerals. And Fred, if you could just take it on to the next slide, please. And I won't go through the strategy in detail itself, but really talk to what Australia has been doing, from the policy sort of perspective in this area, and touch on some of those things before stepping through into the foreign investment side of it. So first, you'll see there on the right-hand side a list of 24 minerals. They're Australia's critical minerals list. Now, each country has its own, and they're all slightly different. Australia's list takes account of our resource endowment potential and our perception of what there will be demand for. The federal government has, from its 2019 strategy, progressed to put a lot of resources into, excuse the pun, into the further development of the market in this space. I mean, it's got its ongoing promotion with the usual trade-style missions, presentations, sessions. One that we partnered with Fasken and Austrade, the Australian investment arm, at PDAC in March this year, promoting the Australian sort of critical mineral strategy. Second, they put a lot of work into collating all of the information from all of the states with Geoscience Australia, our government geological survey body, and released what is the Australian Critical Minerals Prospectus, which is showing up on the front of that screen there and available at the links on the page. And they're actually going to go online with that data, the underlying data, and that's just been announced in the last couple of weeks. So they're putting a lot of effort into collating information to make it available to investors, and they have established, and if you just to the next slide, please, Fareed. They have established a critical minerals facilitation office within our Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources, with a broad remit to effectively be the central coordination point to assist with development of critical minerals projects and the investment in the critical minerals sector. And this Critical Minerals Facilitation Office actually has a broader role to also advise on national policy and strategic advice to government, including relevantly foreign investment into the sector. And I'll come back to that. Since January, when that Critical Minerals Facilitation Office was established, our federal government has been rather busy, COVID-19 notwithstanding, and has held dialogue and reached commitments with Japan, particularly in relation to supply chains for rare earths. You may recall a number of years ago there was an issue with supply of rare earths to Japan from China. With the US in relation to an action plan on critical minerals, again around collaboration towards sufficiency of supply chain. I think we'll see more there. Canada in relation to collaboration agreement on critical minerals. And only a couple of weeks ago, we signed a new memorandum of understanding with India in relation to critical minerals, sharing of information, collaboration on research and developing supply chains. So the government has had, 4 bilateral discussions on critical minerals and has given commitments, one might say soft at times, but commitments around developing improved supply chains and diversifying supply. So we've got that at the federal level in Australia. We also have a significant amount of state support and promotion of minerals investment more broadly, but it is taking a bent towards the critical minerals sector. Western Australia, which is where the majority, in fact, nearly all of our lithium projects are, for example, has a Western Australian battery industry in terms of promoting downstream investment and the lithium hydroxide plants. There are 2 of those, one by Tianqi, a Chinese Shenzhen listed company, and Albemarle has a second one, and both of those are under construction. One of them nearly commissioned, one for commissioning next year. And so there's a lot of work going into that, and there is available funding towards critical minerals investment in exploration partnerships and concessional loans from the government, because a number of the critical minerals projects are located in Northern Australia where the government's trying to support further investment. And lithium miners got funding to build roads, there's been port facilities built and that sort of stuff. So the government's putting a lot into trying to invigorate the sector. And finally, there are challenges, and I've mentioned at the bottom of the slide there that things like state government royalties in Australia, the minerals are all owned by the state and pay a royalty to the state, but the royalty regimes are only catching up to these new minerals in downstream processing of them. And when you're trying to incentivise downstream processing, you have to take account of the value add, and a blanket percentage royalty doesn't work very well in that regard. So they've been looking at all these things and have moved quite quickly to adjust some of the regime and settings to suit. So with all of this sort of investment and trying to promote the sort of critical minerals sector, Australia needs the capital to do so and is relying to a large extent on foreign investment. And Fareed, if you would mind just sliding over to the next slide. So in that context, I'd give a quick understanding of our foreign investment regime, which is effectively a screening of foreign investment transactions to ensure they're not contrary to the Australian national interest. In short, it's mandatory, it requires foreign persons to seek approval before they proceed with transactions. And those, until recently, there were certain dollar thresholds applicable on whether they required to seek approval. Those dollar thresholds were removed recently as part of the COVID-19 response in order to ensure that the government was having oversight of all foreign investment, to ensure there was sort of no distressed asset sales that would have taken them under the thresholds effectively, also was it stated. And there are significant criminal and civil penalties for failing to notify, as well as divestment orders that can be made. But the decision is ultimately one of the Treasurer on advice from the Foreign Investment Review Board, which is an independent non-statutory advisory board. And so there is a level of discretion. And if you were able to go to the next slide, Bruce. What has happened in the last couple of months with 2 investments from 2 Chinese investors, one a state-owned enterprise and one not, Both were rejected by the Treasurer. The first was an investment into Northern Minerals, an ASX-listed miner with a rare earths project in Western Australia. They were only seeking, just over 10% for $20 million Australian, and it was rejected on the basis of being adverse to the national interest. The second one was an investment in a lithium company whose project was not in Australia, it was actually in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and yet it was rejected, or at least advised it would be rejected and withdrawn. And again, only a small percentage. In the second case, with this ABZ Minerals, the transaction was restructured as a less than 10%, which was below the threshold needing approval. But what this has thrown up is that in the critical mineral space, where getting funding is vital and difficult, and secondly, in the circumstances where you have the state or national interest looking at diversification of supply chains, it has, and also there has been some commentary around currently the relationship between China and Australia being a little strained. You have a lot of people wondering what the impact will be on the ability to source additional funding, and when Australia will, or the government, whether it's Australia or other governments, will step in to prevent transactions because of the national interest, and the shareholders in both these companies suffered consequences of not having the ability to secure the funding as they have. So with that, I thought I might just leave that there and hand over, Kevin, back to you. That's a quick summary of some of the challenges that we can get into a little bit more in the Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Simon. Next up, we have Nora Pincus from the law firm of Dorsey Whitney out of Salt Lake City. Nora is nationally recognized for experience guiding mining, oil and gas, renewable energy, and agriculture companies through complicated transactions. Her practice focuses on representing clients in high-value asset transactions, financing, and project development. Nora will be giving us an American perspective on the issue of critical minerals. Over to you, Nora.
Thanks, Kevin, and everyone, thanks for joining. I appreciate being included in this. My perspective on critical mineral development has largely been on the commercial side, helping investors evaluate development of, so-called critical mineral projects in the U.S. Or looking for partnerships for development of critical minerals. And so sort of as a commercial and corporate lawyer, I have been interested in the problems that we have run into that are really on the regulatory side with respect to development of these projects in the U.S. So I just wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about some of the challenges that we have had in the United States in developing some of these projects, and then take a quick look at some of the developments that the federal government has come up with trying to streamline or incentivize development of these projects. And I'll hopefully be fairly brief on that so we can leave a little bit more for the Q&A. Could you hit the next slide, please? Right now, the United States actually has quite an abundance of critical minerals, but we have been very slow to develop projects here in the United States for a variety of reasons. I think largely related to a perceived permitting, real or perceived challenges in permitting timelines. And when you are dealing with commodities that have highly variable pricing, I think that has made 10 plus year, in some cases, permitting timelines in the United States a little bit less interesting to investors, particularly when there are relatively more mature operations or reserves and resources in jurisdictions that have more predictable permitting timelines. Really, the United States has had a dialogue around needing to develop critical mineral resources since the 1970s. And the conversation comes and goes and wanes, depending on where things are technologically speaking. But really, in earnest, beginning in about 2016, the dialogue has been advanced in the United States, at least politically, fairly aggressively. It has been a topic that has been pushed by the Trump administration fairly aggressively. In 2018, the Department of the Interior released the list of 35 so-called critical minerals. This is similar to the Australian list, that would be subject to sort of some unspoken incentivizing or permitting processes. But the first step was releasing this list of critical minerals. Like many other things in the United States and probably other jurisdictions, even just designating these critical minerals became a highly political endeavor, with quite a bit of lobbying going into even just what was going to be designated. Certainly some commodities there I think was less concern about. But in the United States, a lot of the focus was on whether uranium or copper would be designated as critical minerals, which, my personal view as an observer of this is that has really been a bit of a sideshow and taken a lot of focus away of what really truly at its core is a bipartisan issue. Certainly, I think you can't look at the developments or the U.S.'s push to develop more critical mineral resources in the United States without thinking about the so-called trade war with China. As I mentioned, the U.S. is dependent on foreign sources for just under half of the so-called critical minerals, with China being the primary location where most of the critical minerals that are used in U.S. manufacturing originate. Next slide, please, Freed. So this is just a fairly poor quality map, I apologize, showing the distribution of critical minerals globally. And as you can see, the United States really has quite a prolific deposit of let's call them the top 15 critical minerals, but has less than 5% of the development of the rare earth and energy minerals other than uranium. Next slide, please. So the origination, or I guess the beginnings of the most recent push to develop more critical minerals in the United States came with the 2018 Department of Interior list. I think it's interesting what the Department of Interior looked at when they were coming up with this list. They defined critical minerals as those that are essential to the economic or national security of the United States, and that have a supply chain vulnerable to disruption, and support essential functions of the economy within the United States. So that was supposed to be the gating, I guess, categorization for definition of critical minerals. Next slide, please. And we can sort of run through these next slides quickly for Reed. This is the list of minerals that were ultimately listed. Next slide. Then following slide. Very similar to the list that we saw from Australia. And all of these minerals do occur, some with more abundance than others, in the United States. Next slide, please. So really what we saw was a lot of debate around what was going to be designated a critical mineral, but there was a surprising lack of dialogue in what we were going to do as a government to try to stimulate some of this development. Interestingly, over the last 6 weeks, quite a bit has happened in that regard, although nothing has been concrete. We're just seeing a lot of proposals. The first is a bill that was introduced actually just 2 weeks ago in the US Congress, which is aimed at streamlining the permitting process for any mine that would produce a critical mineral as either the primary target or a secondary mineral produced. As I mentioned, there can be a somewhat unpredictable permitting timeline for most major mines in the US. Right now, the National Mining Association estimates that most major mine development from a permitting standpoint takes 7 to 10 years. This proposal has been to move mandatory permitting times to less than 2 years for any critical mineral. Likewise, there have been other bills to streamline permitting. These have taken on a very political dimension, as most mining projects in the United States do. A bit of an observation here is that I think that, like many jurisdictions, we have a fairly binary view in the United States of mineral development. And I think that it's really going to take a fair amount of change in the narrative for some of these more political proposals, such as speeding up a permitting timeline, to really take hold. My view is that I think some of the more popular downstream users of these minerals really need to get directly involved in the dialogue about why these operations are important and critical to a clean energy future. So moving on, so there are several proposals in the US Senate for a range of tax incentives for critical mineral development. And this would be both mineral extraction and processing facilities in the United States. One item that has not been talked about too much, but is really, I think, the upside for recycling and mineral extraction, I guess, for lack of a better word, through recycling. And the bill in the Senate also includes tax incentives and some seed grant money for recycling processing facilities in the United States. Likewise, there's also a proposal to require the Defense Department to source any critical minerals that are used in Defense Department manufacturing processes and major contractor supplies domestically. One more slide quickly. I know I'm a little bit over time. Likewise, with Australia, the State Department is working to try to formalize partnerships with so-called, friendly trade jurisdictions such as Australia and Canada to import more minerals. I think that these are in early stages, and I think that the United States has some supply chain challenges related to these proposals to partner with, other states in terms of just bringing in minerals. And then finally, one interesting project is that the Pentagon is starting to look at getting directly involved in what is really the only U.S. critical mineral mine, which is in Mountain Pass, California. This is a mine that a number of different investors, some foreign and some domestic, have invested in over time. It's a fairly interesting story of this mine that is sort of beyond the scope of this conversation, but it's a fairly rich resource that no private companies have really been able to develop because of large fluctuations in commodity prices over time. And I think in an attempt to stabilize that, the US government, and particularly the Department of Defense, has come to the conclusion that it might need direct investment from the government rather than relying on third-party investment to make some of these mines a reality. So with that, I will stop.
All right, thank you very much, Nora. Next, we have Andrew House from our Toronto office. Andrew practices in the area of government relations and political law with a focus on impact of national security as it intersects with business. And he's going to give us just a couple of minutes on the Canadian federal government position regarding critical minerals. Sorry, and my apology, Andrew is in your Ottawa office, not the Toronto office. I'm going to pay for that later.
Thank you, Kevin. And I spent a lot of time in each, so no harm done. So one of the things that I want to talk to you about this morning, by way of background, is something that I did in a previous existence before coming to Fasken, which was to work inside the federal government, working on the government side of national security reviews. And what I noticed was the prominence of what's called critical infrastructure as it came to the forefront of a national security debate. And one of the items of critical infrastructure that was carefully considered would be what's called strategic elements, or now coming to be called critical elements. And the elements, of course, under discussion are those on the periodic table. So here's a great headline, a recent headline: Canada is the mineral grocery store of the world. And from the Mining Association of Canada, Canada is a top 5 country in the global production of 15 minerals and metals considered critical, including things like cobalt, copper, sometimes critical, sometimes not, precious metals, some of them critical, some of them not, nickel, uranium, to name but a few. Many of these essential to new technologies, including clean tech, and those which are essential for an electronic vehicle future. So what Canada has done is in my mind, and you'll tell that I find this somewhat amusing, is to do a quintessentially Canadian thing and designated not those minerals that Canada believes are critical to its own safety and security, but rather designated as critical minerals that it believes its close allies believe are critical. And so you see in Canada's list a footnote which is worth noting. Selected minerals are those that have been identified as critical by Canada's key trading partners. And so Canada is, in its role as the mineral grocery store to the world, identifying quite helpfully what it believes its key allies want and need. And I guess it's that need which is so important to emphasize. All of this said, if you are in the Canadian mining business, you find out very quickly what Canada believes is critical to its own safety and security when you go to engage in M&A. And you heard Simon refer to the M&A world, and Nora has referred to this in the American context as well. And so one of the guidelines which was issued in 2016 around M&A, which obviously impacts the mining world, is whether a transaction would be injurious to Canada's international relations. And that so closely lines up with the list of critical elements in the sense that Canada, in the midst of a deal to purchase a Canadian mining interest, will look at the impact that sale may have on the view of Canada by its close allies, the United States, New Zealand, Australia, and obviously Great Britain and the United Kingdom, rather. And this is many of you will recognize the list of the Five Eyes allies with which Canada has such a warm and ongoing relationship. Finally, I'll simply mention that Canada has signed on to, and this was mentioned by Nora, something called the Energy Resource Governance Initiative. It's US-led, and it's designed to shore up secure and resilient supply chains, which again is in my view code for how do we find a way globally as a group of allies which are like-minded to secure supply of things like the rare earth elements without referring to these, for instance, the Chinese marketplace. Where else can we find those critical elements that are so necessary for technology and defense applications? With that, I'd like to leave room for questions and obviously for our other presenters, and I thank you for your attention and participation today.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And just a reminder to everybody to get your questions coming in. There's already been a number of questions arriving, but please add yours to the list. Finally, our keynote is from Don Bubar. Don is the president and CEO of Avalon Advanced Minerals. And he's been working with Avalon since 1995 and has transformed the company into one that specializes in critical metals and minerals with 3 advanced stage projects in lithium, tin, and indium, as well as rare earth elements, tantalum, niobium, and zirconium. These 3 projects are the Separation Rapids Lithium Project near Kenora, Ontario. It's East Kemptville Tin Indium Project in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, as well as its Nechalaco rare earths asset in Thor Lake, Northwest Territories. Don, over to you.
Thanks, Kevin, for that introduction, and good to be here and provide you with some perspective from an entrepreneur that's been in this business for over 20 years now, looking at critical minerals. So I'm very well experienced in what the opportunities are, but also what some of the challenges are that our new producers are facing today. And we've heard some of this already spoken to a little bit by Nora, and I think I can probably add perspective to quite a few things that were already addressed earlier on, given my experience in this area. So I guess having me in the cleanup position wasn't a bad idea, Kevin. But start by just speaking to how everyone's been talking about this being part of the mining industry. My experience is that this is a very different business than the traditional mining industry. And it's an important thing for regulators to understand because it needs to be looked at differently from a regulatory standpoint too, both in terms of the risks and the impacts on the environment and the challenges that new producers are facing to get them started. That's because the traditional mining industry, especially in jurisdictions like Canada, has only ever been really focused on traditional commodities that are exchange traded or bulk commodities for which there's no real uncertainty about whether you have a market for the product or not. So the game has always been to find the biggest, highest grade resource you can and build it at the largest scale so you can keep your unit costs as low as possible. Well, with these non-traditional emerging new critical minerals, that's simply not applicable. You have to adapt to the circumstances in the marketplace in terms of being able to provide the end users with the product that they're looking for, meet their specifications, and be able to adapt to change. A lot of the demand for these critical minerals is from new technology, and those technologies are changing and evolving all the time in terms of the materials that they need. So it's not a static environment at all. You've got to be very, very adaptable to it. Kevin, you can move to the next slide there too. So I like to characterize it as more like a manufacturing business than a traditional mining business. You got to get some rock out of the ground and crush it, but after that, it's really what you do with it to turn it into that refined product that can then be used in the many new emerging markets in clean technology and defense technology. So it's really more like a manufacturing business. You have to identify the markets for these minerals and what the specifications are that are required at an early stage. Then you need to start sampling the resource to figure out how you can most efficiently process it to recover the minerals of interest and turn them into the forms that are needed by your customers. So unlike the traditional mining business, bulk sampling needs to be done in an early stage, because it's not so much about defining how big the resource is, it's defining whether it's suitable for recovering the products that you want to be able to supply into the marketplace. Then, of course, the markets are not wide open everywhere. You need to, because they're not exchange traded, there's no real visibility on pricing that there is for traditional exchange traded commodities like gold. So you need to find customers that will enter into offtake agreements that will then demonstrate to other investors that you have markets to sell to and attract capital to allow you to get your operation started. So that's often challenging, because often the end users don't want you to tell anyone that they're interested in their material because they're using it in new technology. So I think the way to go with this is to don't look at it like miners do as building the biggest operation you can. Start your operation at a modest scale, but build scalability into the operations so that you can increase your production as demand grows. You can change your flow sheet as new markets are identified and basically adapt to the changing circumstances. And Paul spoke about lithium earlier, and I think lithium's a good example of the need for adaptability, because lithium-ion battery, as we've heard of it, is still continuing to evolve as a technology. And the form of lithium that's needed in tomorrow's lithium battery is going to be different than today's. So if you build a big operation to produce the material needed for today's batteries, you might not have any customers 5 or 10 years from now. So you have to be aware of how things can change very, very rapidly out there. And what we've found is that, unfortunately, present mining regulations here in Canada, the US, and in other parts of the world do not recognize these differences, and it creates unnecessary barriers to entry for new suppliers. They don't recognize that these are often smaller scale operations with much smaller impacts. And the main thing I've run into with our lithium project is they treat a bulk sample as if that's the very last step before you're going to flip the switch on a giant open pit mining operation. So they put you through endless hoops on permissions and approvals before they'll give you permission to take a bulk sample. So we need to get the government to make some changes. And I've been working on that with a group of like-minded people in the industry, including Michael Barassa, who is a part of this today, to advise the government here in Ontario what they can do. And we view this as an opportunity to actually create a new act altogether that has regulations specific to these critical minerals that recognizes the differences and will shorten up the timelines on getting new operations started. So there's lots of opportunities here. As was said earlier, in Canada, we've got them all in the ground, and the opportunities are there to develop them, to serve whatever the market wants because of the abundance of resources of these critical minerals in northern Canada, and help get the economy restarted in many northern parts of the country, assist First Nations with their aspirations to become more active in the economy. So lots of opportunities there. And one thing I wanted to speak to too on the subject of environmental, and Nora talked about recycling. Another really important opportunity that we've been looking at is the potential to recover a lot of these critical minerals from mine waste. In other words, take advantage of already mined material and get more value out of that material. And there are a lot of examples of mineral resources that were developed for one traditional commodity historically, say copper, that might have had half a dozen other elements enriched in it that had no market 50 years ago that have markets today. So in a lot of cases, closed mine sites that are often viewed as environmental liabilities and no-go zones, have acid mine drainage or something, actually represent opportunities to redevelop, to extract these minerals or elements from the waste materials and the tailings and clean up the site while you do it. And that's one of the things I've been working on for rare earths in the United States. Is there are a lot of old coal mines, hundreds and hundreds of them actually, that are shut down now, have acid mine drainage issues, but there are rare earths enriched in the waste there. And if they're in the acid mine drainage, not that difficult to get them out. So I think there's a real opportunity there to take advantage of circumstances like that to establish these supply chains relatively quickly and without the impacts on the environment that are typically associated with traditional mining. So that's one of the many opportunities I see out there that we're trying to educate the public and the regulators on, to remove those barriers and let us entrepreneurs get the whole thing started. And how am I doing for time there, Kevin?
You're good. If you have something else to add to it, you got a couple more minutes.
Yeah, I guess one other thing I can mention is that another one of the barriers to entry is a lot of the entrepreneurs in this country are in the mineral exploration business, do it through small cap publicly traded companies. And over the years, the regulations have evolved there to govern these companies like ours as if you only just looked at traditional commodities too. And one of the other issues we deal with is National Instrument 43-101 that regulates reporting of how mineral resources are reported. And of course, that was implemented 25 years ago as a response to the Bre-X scandal. And it has done a good job in terms of preventing more similar scandals on misreporting or lying about the size and grade of a gold resource. But with these critical minerals, it doesn't really apply to them actually, and they shouldn't really apply it to companies that are focused in this area, because size and grade doesn't matter. As I said earlier, it's all about the product and whether you have a market to sell it into. And in fact, the risk with it now is you can get somebody that is just purely a promoter talking about having the biggest, highest grade lithium resource in the world, but it may not be worth anything if he hasn't defined how to turn it into a product. And he can say, well, it's 43-101 compliant, therefore it must be good, whereas maybe it isn't actually a real valid investment opportunity at the end of the day. So I'm hopeful that there's opportunities for the securities regulations to be adjusted to adapt to this reality, the markets for critical minerals and the entrepreneurs that want to start them.
Thank you so much, John. We're going to move now to the question and answer portion. We've got a couple of questions that have come in already as well from a number of different avenues. I'm going to start off with this one, which goes to the entire panel. So just kind of unmute if you'd like to go first on it. And it is this, like as we have heard throughout this presentation, there are discrepancies and differences in the approach to how countries define what critical minerals are, like how they develop their lists. And I wonder if anyone would like to comment on a couple of different aspects about that. Like, what are the effects of there being different lists and different elements on different lists, as well as how these lists are updated and how often? Anyone want to take a stab at that?
Well, I'll give a cynical and flippant viewpoint first, I would say lobbyists play a large role in designation of certain minerals, you know, in addition to sort of the obvious rare earth and other energy minerals.
Andrew, you want to comment on that?
As a sometimes lobbyist, I just have to, you know, try very hard not to be offended. But Nora, I think you're exactly right, and I might put the question back to Nora. In the case of gold in the U.S., there was this debate about whether gold should be on the U.S. Geological Survey list, the Department of the Interior list, and a lot of back and forth. It didn't make it onto the list. It is highly useful in electronic applications. It's obviously precious and valuable, but it's not critical. And I think this is an important distinction for those listening. The fact that something isn't critical doesn't mean it's not valuable. Otherwise, why would we mine it? Obviously, gold is valuable. But Nora, if you have any inside track on the U.S. experience, I'd love to hear about it, actually.
You know, I guess I would say that I think that the conversation around gold is similar to the conversation around copper. Those two elements were ultimately not included on the list. The Department of Interior has said that the list is not complete and that it is a moving target and additional elements may be added going forward. But I think that the debate or the dialogue is somewhat centered on what are the minerals that really need stimulus and help developing in the United States. And you know, the U.S. really is a quite prolific gold producer, and there is already quite a bit of investment in gold production. Same somewhat with copper, although we've seen our copper development wane a little bit over the last decade. But I think that sort of the focus, at least on the first stab, was sectors that really do need a little bit of help to get investment in projects started.
I can comment too, Kevin. In the U.S., basically the list was based on defense needs, and that makes total sense there. In other jurisdictions such as Canada, the trend seems to be towards critical minerals being more those that are needed in new clean technology, and that makes sense. And in both cases, there is overlap, but I think where they need to go with it is limit it to the ones that are kind of new emerging commodities that don't have existing supply chains. And that's where the challenges are. Some of the ones that are critical are not that hard to find that do have existing supply chains. For example, nickel needed in lithium-ion battery technology too. So I would focus more on the ones that are not well known and not well established in terms of supply chains.
So moving on, but continuing with the idea of the list, Andrew, could you talk a little bit about what the effect of being on that list of critical minerals means in the Canadian context in regards to M&A activity?
Sure, and you know, the analogy that comes to mind, and it's not a perfect one, no analogy is almost like owning a heritage property where you've got a very valuable piece of real estate. You want to deal with it as you see fit in the M&A world, only to find out that the government has designs on that property as well. You know, they believe that it's very important, and they are outwardly interested in allowing you to operate in a free market economy, but behind the scenes there are other imperatives. And one of those imperatives, as Don has alluded to, are Canada's defense capabilities and its relationship with close friends and neighbors, and maybe the defense capabilities of those neighbors. And here I use the word neighbor because it goes along with the heritage designation and also alludes to the United States. Canada may have plenty of a particular element, but the United States may not, and may be looking at Canada for supply. And this is the name of the game right now, is can you get that raw material quickly in a sense which is assured. And so supply chain assurance and integrity becomes a big part of the equation. And in Canada, when we make lists, they often come forward as a regulation. In this case, I don't have the sense that that there was any real formal lawmaking process, but there was a lot of thought put into the creation of the list in terms of evaluating the needs of our close allies. And as it came forward, it certainly reflects a very internationalized view of what is critical and where Canada fits into that supply chain, not only as a present reality, but in the sense of future potential as countries like the UK and like the United States and our other allies refocus their sourcing of minerals through a lens that has a lot more to do with safety and security and the essential interests of citizens than it does with free trade, which has been a traditionally in the last generation more the focus.
Thanks, Andrew. And you mentioned the other jurisdictions, in particular, Nora, I'd like to move to the US. You talked about moving from kind of a 7 to 10 year plus permitting down to less than 2 years, which I'm sure made John's ears perk up and think that you might want to head down there. It sounds pretty good, and very ambitious. But leaving that aside as maybe sometime in the future, what are the major obstacles right now to developing critical mineral resources in the US?
I think permitting or perceived concerns with permitting timeline, I think is large. I think that is not limited to critical minerals. I think that the United States has some supply chain issues in that really, 20 years ago, we had much more of an integrated supply chain within the United States. I think it's, like many jurisdictions, much more of a global supply chain, and there is much more movement, both of commodities and the manufacturing process. But I think that the United States really has not kept up, really from an infrastructure and investment point of view, to integrate domestic mineral resources into the manufacturing supply chain in ways that other jurisdictions like Canada or Australia have. So I think that in many ways is one threshold logistical challenge. I also think that similar to the Canadian foreign investment process that was talked about, I think that there's a view that the US foreign investment review process can pose problems, particularly for these types of elements. I have some personal experience with trying to help a foreign entity, state-owned entity, make an investment in a Vanadium project. And that was, while I think probably ultimately would have made it through CFIUS review, the regulatory framework and the process was so unclear that it did not make commercial sense to move forward. So I think that there are some old-fashioned regulatory hurdles that will need to be addressed.
Thank you, Nora. And moving forward on the theme of kind of the national security review, Simon, could you talk a little bit about the sensitivities around the fact that both of the examples you brought forward were in relation to Chinese investments, and the difficulty that China is having with its relationships with Canada, with Australia, with the United States. So you could put that in a bit of context there.
Sure. Yeah, look, certainly the Australian, the Foreign Investment Review Board in Australia has been sort of careful not to sort of couch the rejections in terms of China. and it's probably, and we've got a number of investments from Chinese companies that are being approved in non-critical minerals. So it is a suggestion that it is might be taken to be a suggestion that it is concerned with China's market position in the minerals that is being involved. But there are also other facts that are, and because one of the circumstances, for example, of one of the investments, there were other Chinese investors already in the entity concerned. And in fact, Australia rejected an investment by a Chinese, I think it was China Non-Ferrous, that tried to invest in Linus back in 2009, I think it was, into rare earths. So in fact, Australia had rejected an investment by a Chinese company, 10, 11 years ago. And so perhaps it was more indicative of a, competition law, competition aspects back then were probably just as much of the issue, but already perceiving a concern about the market position of China in that, particularly in rare earths. So rejection of a new rare earth thing was really being flagged many years ago. So perhaps not so recent, but the rejection of the lithium investment, where nothing to do with Australia, was perhaps the one that was a little bit more challenging to explain. There's certainly political winds which are impacting the circumstances at the moment, and foreign investment and national interest are tied up in that to a large extent, particularly when it's just the Treasurer who has the ultimate decision. So there'll be more to be seen, I think, very short in the short term there, given where things are presently.
Thanks, Simon. We have a question now coming in from Manuel Tagel, excuse my pronunciation. And I think, Paul, perhaps you might be able to address this one. And what he asks is that, in particular with respect to lithium projects, fresh water can be a key issue, and whether or not there's a role for desalination plants in the development of such projects.
Interesting question. I have not run into that issue directly. My experience is more on the Argentina side, where, notwithstanding it's arid in these areas where you find salt lakes or salars, there isn't the scarcity of water supply as you have on the Chilean side. I know that almost all the major, if not all the major copper and mining projects in Chile do now use desalination for water, given that it's so scarce. I know that the Salar de Atacama, which is where the two main brine producers, S2M and Albemarle, sit, and they produce, call it 120,000 tons of lithium carbonate a year from that Salar. I know that is having water issues, and that the water table, because it's been in production since the 70s, the water table at that Salar, which is in the most arid desert in the world, and consequently highest grade and kind of blue ribbon asset. Anyway, it is having water issues, and because as the water table drops, it starts affecting the life that exists in a broader area around that Salar. So that Salar has a huge water issue. Are they using desalinated water to inject back into the Salar? Perhaps, but I don't know directly.
Thanks, Paul.
One thing,
Guy, sorry, go ahead. Who's that now?
So that was me. I was just going to say one thing to comment on that is that in relation to Manuel's question, I think using renewable energy in order to power a modular desalination plant is a kind of innovation that we're seeing recently, because the real issue that you have with desalination is the immense power consumption. So that's obviously provides a very, very high cost if you were to, power it with some kind of, diesel gensets. But if you're able to have a solar power, for example, then you can bring down the costs of desalination and possibly make that much more cost effective, but also delivering it, within the kind of social license to operate.
Thanks, Guy. Actually, the next question I have here is for you, so keep your mic on. And that's around your discussion of the hydrogen economy and whether or not that is yet another one of these technologies that's going to change. I mean, it's been around a while, but it's kind of finding its feet, and whether that will change that need for battery storage.
Very interesting. I mean, I think one of the issues with hydrogen is that people talk about hydrogen, and really they're referring to green hydrogen, which is where you are actually producing the hydrogen from electrolysis of water using renewable energy. The reality is that in most parts of the world, there isn't cheap enough power or abundant enough infrastructure to actually provide that. So most of the hydrogen which is produced today is actually produced from methane through steam methane reformation. And unless you're able to capture the carbon that is thrown off in that process, which is incredibly challenging at this time on any kind of scale, then you end up with grey or blue hydrogen. So I think there are definitely certain circumstances, certain environments where hydrogen is already a viable option. And I know that in Australia, for example, they've done a lot of work to scope out using hydrogen for long haul. For big trucks, they have these huge trucking routes across the country. And because there's very cheap solar power, hydrogen might be quite a good option in that kind of scenario. But I think what we're probably seeing is a number of different technologies battling it out. So I think the fact is that electric vehicles and the batteries within those are here to stay, at least in terms of passenger transport. In terms of what ends up winning out in HGVs, in marine transport, I think we'll see different type fuel cell solutions. And one of the interesting things is aviation, obviously at the moment immensely polluting. It seems unlikely that batteries are going to be the solution for long haul flights. So it probably will be some type of fuel cell technology which ultimately breaks through in aviation. So what I think to sum up is it's able to be an all of the above solution. And I think at least in the short term, we'll see the development of hydrogen alongside some of the electric and battery storage solutions.
All right, thank you. The next question we have in is from Rudy Cherning, and perhaps Dawn, you could start us off on this. So the question is what this group feels about the thoughts of developing Canadian lithium extraction from brines in the prairies in Canada.
Yeah, that is one of the potentials that is being looked at. You do get low concentrations of lithium in some of the brines associated with the oil fields in Western Canada. And I know there's a couple of companies that are looking at that now. Because the concentrations are low, it's all about being able to come up with innovative high efficiency extraction technology to make it economic to recover it from these brines that have relatively low concentrations. But there are some pretty good ideas being hatched on that, technologies like ion exchange that might be able to accomplish that.
Thank you, John. Next question is for Paul. Given the demand for lithium in EV batteries and the like, and are the kind of major consumer players like Tesla or Panasonic, are they likely to get into the mining space to secure supply?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know that I think it's unlikely. I think a number of the downstream players have looked at this industry very closely. It is highly complex, as Don says. It's not a straightforward mining project. It is a mining project plus a chemical plant, plus, and the end product is very specific and evolving. So lithium carbonate was the material. Now lithium hydroxide has is being produced on par or maybe taking over because there's nickel applications that make it very productive. But the pendulum is now swinging back to carbonate here in China through the CATL battery. So I mean, we've talked to Tesla, for example. They have said categorically, I mean, they can always change their mind, but they said they will not get into mining. There's plenty of examples of Chinese companies like CATL getting into mining. Excuse me. Canada Lithium was a hard rock story that anyway, people in the industry will know well, and it's now in bankruptcy. Namaska's going through a CCAA process. It is highly complex, and these big guys, I think, know that and are not willing to risk the money or the reputational hit or moving the eye off their main industry to get into mining. They'll leave it for others, I'm pretty sure.
Okay. So Don, then if it's not, sorry, go ahead.
So Kevin, and just feeding on from Paul's comments there, certainly Tesla signed up on direct offtake agreement with one of the Australian explorers a couple of years ago. We were never quite sure whether it was partly as they were getting involved in the South Australian battery game, so there was a bit of publicity in it. Their lithium hydroxide project stalled. And then Cattle has, as Paul suggested, invested in a couple of mineral companies in Australia. Pilbara Minerals, Cattle's got 8.5%, took it in November last year. And it was actually backing the AVZ transaction that was blocked by the Australian government because the company even was building the manufacturing facility in China, which Cattle is backing. So it's sort of almost a hedging of investment in the mining companies rather than direct investment in the mining is what we're seeing. Paul, I'm not sure if you've seen something similar.
Yeah, and I can add to that by saying that the alternative for Tesla is to simply enter into an offtake commitment with an emerging new producer at an early stage that will enable them to access the capital they need to start to deliver the product that they need. And when they give them the offtake commitment, it helps that company design the product to meet their specific needs. So they don't need to get in the mining business. They need to enable the new producers to meet their needs.
Yep, and I think that's exactly what the Kidman deal was, but Wesfarmers took Kidman out, so it stalled for that moment.
All right, Nora, you had something to add to that?
Oh, no, I think it was said well. I mean, I think that companies have evaluated, direct involvement in mining processes, but I think what you're going to see a lot more is low-profile joint ventures, probably more on the pilot plant side, to create, or evaluate whether sort of a bespoke product can come out of that. And then more equity investment. And I think we're starting to see a little bit more equity investment in some of the smaller cap companies from the larger off-takers, but I think it's still very early days on that front.
And for our final question, as we're running out of time, I'd like to put something to you again, Don, and that is, if you were to sum up in a very short couple of statements, what is the critical thing that the Canadian government could do to support aspiring new critical minerals producers?
Yeah, one idea I've been advocating for recently is I think there's a role for the Canadian government to consider establishing a strategic critical minerals stockpile. And they could get that started and help with establishing the supply chain simply by offering offtake commitments to aspiring new producers in Canada. And by so doing, they will help those companies get started. Then they can start creating a stockpile of some of these critical minerals that are needed. And that in turn can help attract some of the downstream end users or midstream processors of those materials to turn them into the value-added products that are needed in the supply chain. I think that's an easy way for them to do it because they don't have to pick winners. They just make it available to companies that approach them with a ready-to-go project.
Thank you very much, Don, and thank you very much to everyone on our panel. It's much appreciated you taking the time, and thank you to everyone watching again and for your questions. Please fill out the feedback form that you will find. There should be a button on your screen. In addition, if you'd like to hear more from us on these kind of issues, there are upcoming sessions. The next one, I believe, is the key ESG issues facing the mining industry on June 29th. And if you'd like to sign up for that, just go to our website for Fasken under the mining section. If you just search there, you'll find it. So thank you again. That's the end of our program.